Before this story begins, take one breath. Because what you are about to read is the kind of thing God does not forget. And neither will you. A woman worked 14 hours every single day until the chemicals ate through her skin and her hands bled. She was owed $2,500 in wages. She never received a single dollar of it. She died at 31 years old in a frozen apartment. Not because she was weak, not because she gave up, but because a powerful man decided that her life was worth less than the land beneath her feet. Her daughter was 8 years old. And before her mother drew her last breath, that 8-year-old girl walked 40 minutes alone in the winter cold, into a restaurant full of people who didn't want to see her, and asked a stranger for help. She had already been turned away by 4 people before she found the 5th. The 5th person listened. This is the story of what God saw when no one else was watching. Leave a comment right now. Have you ever watched someone suffer and felt completely powerless to stop it? This story is for every person who has ever felt that way. The restaurant was called Elysian, and it occupied the ground floor of a glass tower on the north side of the city where the streets were wider and the sidewalks were cleaner and the Christmas lights strung between lampposts were white rather than multicolored. Because someone had made an aesthetic decision long ago that white communicated a different class of celebration. The clientele arrived in cars driven by other people. The menus had no prices because the kind of people who ate at Elysian did not need to ask about prices. And for anyone who did need to ask, the absence of numbers was itself the answer. The food arrived on plates that were more architecture than sustenance, designed to be admired before they were consumed. The noise level was precisely calibrated, low enough for conversation, high enough to muffle it from neighboring tables. Everything about the room communicated the same thing, that the world outside its walls operated according to different rules, and that the people inside it had earned the privilege of not having to think about those rules. On a Tuesday evening in December, the coldest night of the year so far, the kind of cold that found the gaps in your coat and made itself at home there, Julian Hayes was sitting at his corner booth, the one he always requested and always received, working through a $240 million acquisition proposal that his assistant had delivered that afternoon. The proposal was for a regional medical group in Sacramento. The numbers were sound. The integration timeline was realistic. He had read the executive summary twice and was midway through the financial appendices when something appeared beside him that did not belong to the category of things that usually appeared beside him in this room. He became aware of her the way you become aware of something that is very quiet but very close. A change in the air rather than a sound, a presence at the edge of attention. He looked up. She was small. Impossibly small for 8 years old, the kind of small that is not about genetics but about not having had enough of something for long enough that the body makes its calculations and adjusts its expectations downward. She was black, brown-skinned, with a face that was round where it should have been fuller, and eyes that were too large and too old for the face they were set in. Her coat was a child's winter coat, once red, he could tell, though it had faded to the uncertain color between rust and forgetting, and it was too short in the sleeves, missing its top 2 buttons, held together at the collar by a safety pin that someone had placed there with great care, the kind of care that goes into a thing when it is the only thing available and it has to be enough. One of her shoelaces was knotted rather than tied. Broken at some point and shortened and knotted so she could still wear the shoe. She was trembling. Not with cold only, though the cold was real and she had walked in it, but with the full-body trembling of a child who has made a decision that frightens her and has come too far down the road of it to unmake it now. She looked at Julian and said nothing for a long moment. He could see her composing herself, not crying, refusing to cry, the chin coming up slightly, the jaw setting. Whatever she was feeling, she had decided she was not going to let him see it in the way that would make her look small. She had come here to ask for help, not to perform the asking. There was a dignity in it that struck him somewhere he hadn't expected to be struck, sitting in his corner booth on a Tuesday evening with his $240 million proposal. "Sir," she said, in a voice so quiet he had to lean forward to catch it. "Please. I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Maya. My mama works here. She cleans the floors and the bathrooms. She's been working here for 8 months, sir, and the man who is in charge of her, he hasn't paid her in 6 weeks. We have no food left. We're going to lose our home. I've been trying to think of what to do for a long time and I couldn't think of anything else, so I came here. I waited outside until I saw someone who looked like they might listen. I'm sorry if this is wrong. I just didn't know who else to ask." She stopped. The chin was still up. The jaw was still set. Whatever it had cost her to say those words in this room to this stranger, she was not going to let the cost show on her face. He set down his pen. "What's your mother's name?" he asked. "Clara," the girl said. "Clara Beaumont. How did you get here tonight?" "I walked. It's 40 minutes. I know the way because Mama sometimes brings me when she has to pick up her work schedule, so I know which streets to take." A pause. "I waited outside for a while. In the cold. I watched through the window until I saw someone who looked like they might stop and listen. I tried 4 people before you. The first 2 didn't look up. The third one called the host over and they walked me back outside. The fourth one listened but then said he was sorry and he couldn't help." Another pause, smaller. "You were the 5th. The 5 of them, the ones who had encountered a trembling 8-year-old child in a restaurant asking for help, and 4 of them had looked away or walked her out." He sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up from the table. "Take me to where your mother is," he said. Maya looked at him with the evaluating look of a child who has learned that adults who offer things sometimes mean them and sometimes don't, and has developed a method for telling the difference. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then she nodded and turned and he followed her through the restaurant, past the white tablecloths and the soft conversations and the food on its architectural plates, past the waitstaff who glanced at the small girl in the faded red coat with expressions ranging from confused to mildly disapproving, through a door at the back marked staff only, down a corridor that smelled of cleaning products and old cooking grease and the particular closed-in smell of spaces that are not designed for people to linger in, to a utility hallway at the far end where the floors were sealed concrete, and the fluorescent lighting buzzed steadily and a woman was on her knees with a mop and a bucket of gray water. Clara Beaumont was 31 years old, and she looked both younger and older than that in the same moment. Younger because her face in repose had the bone structure of a woman who would always be considered beautiful, older because illness and exhaustion and months of a very particular kind of stress had hollowed something out behind her eyes that sleep alone could not restore. She was slight, thinner than she should have been, wearing the kind of thinness that comes from a body that has been rationing its resources for a long time and has gotten very efficient at it. Her hair was pulled back tightly. Her uniform was clean and pressed, which struck Julian as significant, that in the middle of everything this woman was living through, she still pressed her uniform. Her hands were the thing. They were wrapped in strips of cloth, the improvised wrapping of someone whose hands had been damaged badly enough to need protection but not badly enough, or not with enough resources available, to do anything more than wrap them and keep working. Where the skin was visible at her wrists and the backs of her fingers, it was cracked and reddened and raw, the skin of hands that had been submerged for 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, in cleaning chemicals without adequate gloves, because the management had not provided adequate gloves and she had not had the money to buy her own. She looked up when she heard footsteps coming down the corridor. When she saw Julian, the quality of his suit, his posture, the particular ease of a man who is accustomed to rooms accommodating themselves to his presence, her face moved through several things in rapid sequence. Surprise. Weariness. Something that might have been fear or might have been pride. The two feelings often being harder to distinguish than people assume. Then she saw Maya behind him, and every other expression dissolved into the specific expression of a mother seeing her child somewhere the child should not be. Not angry, not relieved, but something that contained both and was larger than either. Maya. Her voice was barely a sound. Baby, what did you do? I asked for help, Mama, Maya said. Her voice was steady, the way a child's voice is steady when they have decided in advance to be steady, and have been practicing the steadiness on the walkover. Like you always told me we should do when we need it. You always said that God puts people in our path for a reason. You said we just have to have the courage to walk toward them, even when we're scared. She paused. I was scared, but I walked anyway, because you taught me to. Clara looked at her daughter for a long moment. Something passed across her face that Julian couldn't fully read. A complexity of feeling that belonged entirely to the private language between a mother and the child she has been trying to protect from exactly this kind of moment, and has failed to protect, and doesn't know yet whether the failure was hers or the world's, or simply the arithmetic of circumstances that eventually exhaust even the most careful planning. Then she looked at Julian. I'm sorry, she said, with the dignity of a woman who is apologizing not because she has done anything wrong but because this is what she has learned to do in situations where her needs have become visible to people with power. Whatever she told you, I don't need, I'm not looking for. Your name is Clara Beaumont, Julian said, gently but clearly. You've worked here for 8 months. You haven't been paid in 6 weeks. That's approximately $2,500 owed to you. I'd like to understand why that is. Clara looked at him steadily. That's a matter between me and the management, she said. Which management? A pause. Something flickered in her eyes. The calculation of a person deciding how much it costs to say the truth versus how much it costs not to. She had been carrying this alone for 6 weeks. The carrying had a weight that was visible in the set of her shoulders, in the way she had positioned the mop handles slightly between herself and the conversation, a small gesture of self-protection she probably wasn't aware she was making. Richard Voss, she said. Where is he right now? She told him. And Julian turned and walked back the way he had come. She walked 40 minutes in the December cold. She was 8 years old. She had already been turned away by 4 people. 4 people looked at a child asking for help and looked away. Type "moi" in the comments if this girl broke your heart. And tell us, would you have been the 5th person who listened? Be honest. Because God is watching that answer too. Share this before you keep reading, because what Julian does next is what justice looks like when someone refuses to be the 4th. Richard Voss was 44 years old and had the build and manner of a man who had spent a long time in positions of small authority over people who had less authority than he did, and had arrived through that experience at a settled and comfortable contempt for them. He was not a cruel man in any dramatic sense. He did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as practical, as someone who understood how things worked and did not waste energy on sentimentality about the way things worked. He was standing near the service bar with his arms crossed, speaking to one of the waitstaff in the tone of a man delivering a correction, when Julian appeared in the dining room. He saw Julian and his posture shifted almost immediately, the arms uncrossed, the face reconfigured into a smile that was warm and deferential and just slightly wider than genuine warmth requires. Mr. Hayes. He came forward, hand extended. I didn't realize you were dining with us this evening. Is there anything I can help you with? Clara Beaumont, Julian said. He did not take the hand. The smile stayed in place, but something behind it changed. A recalibration, a reassessment of what kind of conversation this was going to be. I'm sorry. She works here. She has worked here for 8 months. She has not been paid in 6 weeks. I would like to understand the mechanism that produces that outcome. The smile reconfigured itself into something more careful. Mr. Hayes, employee compensation matters are really best handled through internal HR channels. If there's been an issue with a particular employee's payment processing, I'd be happy to have someone look into. She works a 14-hour day, 6 days a week. At her hourly rate, 6 weeks of unpaid wages comes to approximately $2,500. I want to know what administrative mechanism has been holding $2,500 of earned wages from a woman whose hands are currently wrapped in cloth strips because she cannot afford proper protective equipment for the work she does in this building. 2 nearby waitstaff drifted quietly to other parts of the room. Richard Voss looked at Julian with an expression that was doing a great deal of work, maintaining the form of professional calm while something underneath it was moving rapidly. He had calculated, Julian could see, that this was likely a concerned regular customer who would be mollified by a reasonable-sounding explanation. Julian let him make the calculation. Let him commit to it. There were some documentation issues, Richard said. Her employment paperwork had some inconsistencies that needed to be resolved before payment could be processed. It's a standard HR protocol, and these things take time when. She has been employed here for 8 months, Julian said. His voice was entirely level. This, he had learned over 30 years, was more effective than any other register. A raised voice gave the other person something to push against. A level voice gave them nothing. Her documentation was verified before she started work. If there were inconsistencies in her paperwork, they would have been identified in the first pay period, not the 32nd. That explanation does not hold. Try another one. The smile flickered, steadied, flickered again. Look, Richard said. And now the warmth drained fully out of his voice, and what was left was the flat tone of a man who has decided that pretending is no longer economical. She's had performance issues. There have been complaints from other staff. We've been in the process of evaluating whether to continue her employment, and in the meantime, you withheld her wages. It is not a complicated situation. Julian was still entirely level. He was not angry, or rather, he was very angry, and the anger had no interest in expressing itself as volume. A woman worked for you for 6 weeks and was not compensated for that work. Everything you are telling me is elaboration layered over that central fact, and none of the elaborations change the fact. She worked. She was not paid. In this state, that is not a management dispute. That is wage theft. That is a criminal matter. And the performance issues and the HR protocols and the documentation inconsistencies, none of those things are a defense to wage theft. They are noise around a fact. Richard Voss stared at him. The professional composure was still there on the surface, just barely, but beneath it, Julian could see the arithmetic changing. The calculation that had assumed this would be manageable was being revised. I'm going to offer you a simple choice, Julian said. You can write Clara Beaumont a check for $2,500 right now, tonight, and I will treat this as a private matter resolved between the relevant parties. Or you can continue explaining to me about documentation inconsistencies, and I will place a call to a labor attorney I have known for 22 years who has a particular interest in wage theft cases involving vulnerable workers, and I will also place a call to the journalist who covered a similar story about this restaurant group 3 years ago, and who I believe would find the current situation very worth revisiting. One of those choices inconveniences your evening. The other choice ends considerably more than your evening. I would encourage you to think carefully about which one you want. Richard Voss reached into his jacket. He produced a checkbook. He wrote in silence, the pen moving with the tight, resentful motion of someone who hates every stroke but has decided the alternative is worse. While he was writing, Julian said, quietly and without emphasis, "God sees everything that happens in the dark, Richard. Every hour of unpaid work. Every wrapped hand. Every empty refrigerator. Every night a child went to bed hungry because a man decided her mother's labor was worth nothing. God sees all of it. And so now do I." Richard did not look up. He tore the check from the book and held it out. Julian took it and walked back through the restaurant, through the staff corridor, to the utility hallway where Clara was still on her knees with the gray water in the bucket. She looked up when she heard him coming. He held out the check. She looked at it without taking it. Then she looked at him. "What did you do?" "I had a conversation," he said. "This is what you're owed. Not a gift. Not charity. Not a favor from someone with more than you. What you earned. Every single hour of it." Clara took the check with both hands, her wrapped, damaged, exhausted hands, and she looked at it for a long time. A long time during which her face moved through things she was trying to control and mostly succeeded in controlling, except for the last one. A single slow exhalation, the sound a person makes when they release something they have been holding for so long that letting go of it takes more out of them than the holding did. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was very small. "Don't thank me," Julian said. "Thank Maya. She's the one who walked 40 minutes in the cold to find someone willing to listen. I was just the 5th person she asked." He was about to leave. The acquisition proposal was still on his table. His evening was recoverable. He had done a good thing, intervened, restored the money, warned Richard Voss, and he could go back to his corner booth and his Sacramento medical group and his ordinary life. He was forming the words to say good night when something stopped him. He couldn't have said exactly what it was. Feeling, perhaps. Or the memory of Maya's face when she said, "You were the 5th person I tried." Or simply the sense that what he had done, while right, was not all of what was needed. That Richard Voss withholding wages for 6 weeks was not the whole story. That a man does not do something like that without a reason. "Tell me where you live," he said. Clara looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because Richard Voss withheld your wages for 6 weeks. That is not what careless or lazy management looks like. That is what deliberate pressure looks like. And deliberate pressure comes from somewhere. I want to know where." She was still for a moment. He could see her weighing it, whether to trust this further, whether the trust would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. Then she said, "Caldwell Street and 9th Building 4. Apartment 3C. God sees everything in the dark. And so now do I." Comment those exact words if Julian just said what needed to be said. Because the powerful have always believed the darkness belongs to them. They count on it. They build entire empires on the assumption that what happens in the dark stays there. They are wrong. Share this and stay with the story. Because what Julian's investigator finds at Caldwell Street and 9th will change everything you think you know about why Clara was suffering. Julian's investigator was a man named Garrett who had worked in corporate intelligence for 20 years, who had a talent for following money through structures designed to obscure it, and who had learned over those 20 years that the most important thing a paper trail reveals is not the thing at the end of it but the shape of the path itself, that how someone hides something tells you as much as what they're hiding. Julian called him from the car on the way home and gave him 2 names and 1 address. Richard Voss, Clara Beaumont, and Caldwell Street and 9th. Garrett called back 36 hours later. "Pull up a map," he said. Specifically the proposed route for the Meridian Rapid Transit Line. The City Council approved it in principle 8 months ago. It's been in engineering review since September. Julian pulled up the map on his laptop. He found the proposed transit line. He found Caldwell Street and Ninth. He understood immediately, with the cold clarity of a man who has spent 30 years reading financial landscapes and knowing what certain arrangements mean. The proposed route ran directly beneath the intersection of Caldwell and Ninth. Not past it, not near it, through it. The engineering documents, which were technically public record but practically inaccessible without knowing where to look and what to look for, showed that the building at Caldwell and Ninth, Building 4, the building where Clara and Maya lived in apartment 3C, sat directly above what the Transit Authority had designated as a primary ventilation and maintenance access shaft for the new line. The infrastructure value of that specific piece of land had been calculated by the engineering firm at approximately $180 million. Not the building, the land beneath it. Who owns the properties surrounding that intersection? Julian asked. That's what took the 36 hours, Garrett said. Over the past 14 months, 47 separate real estate transactions have taken place within a 4-block radius of Caldwell and Ninth. Every property within those 4 blocks has changed hands. The buyer names are all different LLCs, different registered agents, different states of incorporation. But when you trace each one through to its controlling entity, they all terminate in the same place. A private equity vehicle called Meridian Land Holdings LLC. And who controls Meridian Land Holdings? Victor Sterling. Victor Sterling. Julian knew the name the way anyone in his world knew it, by reputation, by the size of the shadow it cast, by the way conversations changed register when it came up. Sterling had spent 25 years building an empire in urban infrastructure development. He was not a man who appeared in news coverage as a villain. He appeared as a visionary, as a philanthropist, as the kind of man whose wealth had achieved the altitude at which it ceased to be a fact about a person and became a fact about the landscape, like a mountain simply there. He had an endowed chair at a university named after him. He had been photographed at state dinners, at ribbon cuttings, at the openings of transit stations and housing developments and civic centers that bore his company's name on the cornerstone plaques. He was, in the conventional imagination, one of the men who built things. He owns everything around Clara's building, Julian said. He owns everything except Clara's building. She has a long-term lease, 12 years remaining on it, executed by the previous building owner before Sterling acquired the property. The lease contains an anti-assignment clause, which means Sterling cannot transfer or void it simply by taking title. Her right to occupy apartment 3C at the current rent is legally airtight. There is no mechanism by which he can remove her through the normal operation of property law. She is, in the technical language of real estate development, a holdout. Julian was quiet. The engineering timeline requires vacant possession of the entire block by March 15th, Garrett continued. That's 10 weeks from now. Every other tenant in the building has already vacated, some through buyouts, some through lease expirations that were not renewed. Clara Beaumont is the last person in that building. The last person between Victor Sterling and $180 million of transit infrastructure development. So he had Richard Voss withhold her wages to starve her out, Julian said. That is the least of it. Garrett's voice went to a register it only reached when what he was about to say required him to remove the emotion from it, just to be able to say it at all. The utility records for that building showed 2 service disconnections in the past 2 months. Water, interrupted for 4 days in November, restored only after a formal city complaint was filed. Heat. The central heating system serving Clara's apartment has been marked as requiring repair since October. The repair request was filed 3 times with the property management company. 3 times it was acknowledged. 3 times it was placed on hold without action taken. It is December, Julian said. Yes. The city conducted a welfare check last week following a neighbor's report. The recorded temperature in apartment 3C at the time of the inspection was 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The inspector noted that the tenant had sealed the windows with plastic sheeting, presumably purchased with personal funds, in an attempt to reduce heat loss. He also noted visible evidence of dampness in the walls consistent with the heating system failure. Julian stood up from his desk. He was not fully aware of doing it. His body simply made the decision before the rest of him caught up. "She has a respiratory condition," Garrett said. "I found it in a clinic record from 2 years ago. She was treated for occupational lung damage, the kind that develops from long-term exposure to cleaning chemicals without adequate protective equipment. Her lung capacity is significantly compromised. A person with compromised lungs, living in an unheated apartment in December, in a state of malnutrition, under sustained psychological and financial stress." He stopped. "Say it," Julian said. "She is in serious danger." The combination of factors, the cold, the chemical damage, the malnutrition, the stress, is not something a body in her condition can sustain. Not at the current trajectory. Not for much longer. Julian was already picking up his car keys. He drove in 22 minutes, which was 11 less than it should have taken, and he did not think about the 2 red lights he went through because the alternative was arriving later and later was not acceptable. The building at Caldwell and 9th was exactly what he had expected from the outside and worse than he had expected from the inside. A structure from which all the ordinary signs of inhabitedness had been stripped, leaving the skeleton of a building that had once been a home and was now being systematically persuaded to become a construction site. The lobby door opened without a key, the lock mechanism long since broken and not repaired. The elevator was out of service. He went up 3 flights of stairs with his phone's flashlight and knocked on the door of 3C. A pause. Small footsteps. The bolt drawn back. Clara opened the door, and she was wearing her coat inside her own apartment. Maya was beside her, wrapped in a blanket from the bed, their breath visible in the cold air of the hallway because the air inside the apartment was cold enough to make breath visible. The windows were sealed with plastic sheeting taped to the frames with a care and thoroughness that communicated how long it had been necessary. The lamp in the corner threw a circle of warm light that stopped well short of the walls. On the kitchen counter, a single pot and a box of crackers. On the coffee table, Maya's school books open with homework partially completed. She was doing her homework. In a coat. In an apartment at 41 degrees. She was doing her homework. "You're leaving tonight," Julian said. "Both of you. Pack whatever is most important. I'll explain everything, but right now I need you to come with me." "We are not charity cases, Mr. Hayes," Clara said. Her voice was quiet and absolute. "No," he said. "You are not. You are a woman who has been deliberately targeted by a man with significant resources, who needs you out of this apartment for reasons that have nothing to do with you, and everything to do with the ground beneath your feet. What is happening to you is not the result of bad luck or misfortune. It is the result of a decision made by a specific person who decided that your survival was an obstacle to his profit. This is not charity. This is me telling you that you are in physical danger tonight, and that I have the means to address that danger, and I am asking you to let me." She looked at him for a long time. The evaluating look. The look that had its echo in Maya's face. The same careful, clear-eyed assessment of whether this was real. Whether this was the kind of help that costs more than it gives. Then she turned to Maya. "Get your things, baby. The things that matter most." Maya was back in 2 minutes with a backpack and a framed photograph of herself and her mother taken on a beach somewhere, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, and her school bag, because it had not occurred to her even in this moment to leave the schoolwork behind. Julian settled them in a hotel that night. Clean and warm, 2 beds, a bathroom with hot water, room service that Maya examined with the careful wonder of someone encountering an entirely new category of experience. He told Clara to rest. He told her he would explain everything in the morning, and that tonight the only thing required of her was to be warm and fed and safe. He told Maya when he said goodnight that she had done the right thing. 40 minutes in the cold. 5 tries. The right thing. Maya looked up at him from the bed with her 2 old eyes. My mama always says that God doesn't give us problems without giving us a way through them, she said. She says the way through is always there. We just have to be brave enough to walk toward it, even when we're scared. A pause. I was very scared tonight. I know, Julian said. But I walked anyway. You did. Because Mama taught me that the bravery isn't the not being scared. She says the bravery is the walking. Just putting one foot in front of the other when everything in you wants to stop. She looked at the photograph on the nightstand, herself and Clara on that beach both laughing. She's very brave too, even though she doesn't always know it. She is, Julian said. Get some sleep. He drove home at 2 in the morning and sat at his desk and called Garrett and then his attorney and then 2 other people whose specific skills were going to be needed for what he was building. And by the time he went to bed, he had the architecture of something that would, in the weeks that followed, become the end of Victor Sterling's plan. He did not yet know that it would also be the end of something else. Clara died 11 days later. The pneumonia had been developing for weeks before she was admitted to the hospital. The cold and the chemicals and the months of malnutrition had dismantled her immune system the way neglect dismantles a building, quietly and incrementally until the structure that remains is not strong enough to withstand what comes next. She went into the hospital on the 8th day after leaving the apartment, burning with fever that the hotel's warmth and the food and the rest had not been enough to stop. Her lungs, which had been compromised for years by the work she did and the equipment she had not been given, could not fight the infection. The doctors were honest with Julian when they spoke to him. They said she had likely been carrying the infection for some time before admission, that the conditions of her housing had been a contributing factor to how rapidly things had declined, that they were doing everything they could but that they needed him to understand the situation clearly. She held Maya's hand for 3 days. Julian sat outside the room for much of that time in the corridor in a chair that was not comfortable, because it seemed wrong to be in a comfortable place while what was happening inside that room was happening. He could hear, sometimes, the low sound of Clara's voice. Not the words, just the cadence of it. The rhythm of a mother talking to her daughter with the specific quality of someone who is saying the things they need to say before they no longer have the opportunity to say them. Maya told him some of it later in pieces over the months that followed. Clara told her she was proud, prouder than she had words for. That the proudest moment of her life was watching her daughter put on her coat and walk out into the cold toward a restaurant where she didn't belong, to ask strangers for help, because she had been taught that asking was not weakness but an act of faith. She told Maya that God had never abandoned them. Not in the worst moments, not in the freezing apartment, not in the 6 weeks of empty refrigerators. That God's presence in hard times didn't mean the removal of hardship. It meant the provision always of exactly what was needed to take the next step. A warm hotel room when the cold had become dangerous. A man in a restaurant who turned out to be the 5th person Maya asked and the one who listened. She told Maya to keep walking toward the way through. Even when she was scared. Even when she was very, very scared. Clara Beaumont died on a Thursday morning in January. She was 31 years old. She had worked every day of her adult life. She had never stolen anything, never cheated anyone, never asked for more than she had earned. She had raised, in circumstances that would have broken most people's capacity for hope, A daughter who walked 40 minutes in the winter cold to ask for help and refused to stop asking until someone listened. She had done honest work. She had done it with dignity. And she had deserved so much more than the world, in its arrangement by men like Victor Sterling, had given her. God had seen every hour of it, every cracked hand, every unpaid shift, every breath of chemical air without a mask, every night in a coat worn inside an apartment where the heat had been deliberately broken because a man in an office 40 miles away needed the land under her feet and had decided that her survival was a problem to be solved rather than a life to be honored. God had seen. And the reckoning was coming. Candle, she died in a warm hospital bed, holding her daughter's hand. Not in that frozen apartment. That is the only mercy in this part of the story. And it is not enough. It will never be enough. Leave a candle in the comments for Clara Beaumont. For every woman who works until her hands bleed and is never paid what she is owed. For every mother who teaches her daughter to be brave while her own body is failing. For every person the powerful have decided is worth less than the land they stand on. Share this right now. Because part 4 is coming. And the night Julian Hayes meets Victor Sterling in the cold outside that building is the night justice stops being a word and becomes an action. Julian spent 3 weeks building what he needed. He had not slept well in those 3 weeks. He told himself at first that this was about the urgency of the situation. There was a great deal to do and doing it quickly mattered. But in the honest hours of 3 and 4 in the morning, when the city was quiet outside his windows and the only thing in the room was the truth of what he was actually feeling, he knew that the sleeplessness was not about urgency. It was about the image he could not stop returning to. Clara in her coat, inside her own apartment, her breath visible in the air, taking the check with her wrapped hands and pressing it against her chest with the exhalation of someone releasing something held too long. He kept thinking about the 11 days between that moment and the morning she died. 11 days in which the check had mattered and the hotel had mattered and Maya had been warm and fed. And it had still not been enough. The damage had been done across months and years, methodically and deliberately, and 11 days of warmth and food could not undo what deliberate harm had done to a body already fighting so hard on so many fronts. He thought about what it meant that the right thing, done too late, is a form of inadequacy dressed as virtue. He thought about this without self-pity. He had arrived too late because he had not known. And he had not known because he had not been looking, and he had not been looking because the world that Clara inhabited and the world that he inhabited were separated by enough distance that a woman could work in his city, cleaning the floors of buildings he walked through for 8 months, and the fact of her existence and her suffering would never have reached him if a child had not walked 40 minutes in the cold to find him. He thought about Maya saying, "You were the 5th person I tried." He thought about what it would have meant if he had been the 4th. And he worked. Garrett spent 3 weeks building the file. 47 pages, 63 exhibits, organized with the precision of a man who understands that evidence is only as useful as the clarity with which it is presented. Phone records documenting communication between Sterling's office and Richard Voss in the weeks before the wage withholding began. A bank transfer of $15,000 from a Sterling-controlled account to a personal account registered in Voss's name. Executed on the day the first paycheck was withheld. The utility company's internal records showing the disconnect orders and their origin. The property management company's maintenance logs showing the heating repair request acknowledged and deferred 3 times. The engineering documents for the transit project. The timeline of the land acquisitions. The medical examiner's preliminary findings regarding the condition of Clara Beaumont's lungs, and the contributing factors to her death. Negligent homicide. That was the phrase Julian's attorney used quietly, in a private meeting in his office on a Monday morning. She used it the way attorneys use phrases that carry enormous weight, carefully, precisely, without drama, making sure he understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it might and might not be possible to prove. Not murder, but the reckless disregard for a human life in circumstances where a reasonable person would have known that the actions being taken created a serious risk of death. The disregard that says, "This person's continued existence is an obstacle to my objective, and I will remove the obstacle through whatever means are available, and if those means happen to endanger her life, that is an acceptable cost." Victor Sterling had made that calculation. He had looked at Clara Beaumont, a 31-year-old woman with compromised lungs and a legal lease and a daughter and a job, and he had calculated that her death was an acceptable cost. Julian had decided it was not. He learned through Garrett that Sterling planned to move on the building on a Wednesday night 3 weeks after Clara's death, to arrive with a crew, clear the remaining contents of the apartment, seal the building, and begin the preparatory demolition work that would convert it from a residential structure to a construction site. He was moving before Julian's attorney's legal filings could reach a hearing date. He was betting that moving the physical reality of the property would change the calculus of the legal proceedings, that a demolished building was a different legal argument than an inhabited one. He was betting that no one would be there. Julian arrived at 10:30 and sat in his car across the street from the building in the cold, the same cold that had been inside that apartment for months while Clara was in it. He felt the cold differently now than he would have felt it 2 months ago, before Maya had stood beside his table in Elysian. He felt it as a thing with intentionality, a thing that someone had chosen not to fix because the cost of fixing it was worth less to that person than the suffering it caused. Sterling arrived at 12:45. 3 vehicles, 2 vans and a black SUV. 6 workers in the vans with equipment and tools. From the SUV, a man Julian recognized from photographs. Tall, late 50s, silver-haired, moving through the cold night air with the unhurried ease of someone who has never had reason to be uncertain about whether the space he is moving into will accommodate him. Julian got out of his car and walked across the street. Sterling saw him and stopped. The calculation moved across his face, visible to Julian, who had spent 30 years watching calculations move across the faces of powerful men. Then Sterling came forward. "Mr. Hayes." Warm. Surprised but not alarmed. The surprise of a man who is comfortable with surprises because his position has always given him enough resources to manage them. "This is unexpected. Is there something I can help you with?" Julian held out the folder. "You can start by reading this." Sterling took it with the ease of a man accepting a document he expects to be manageable. He opened it. He began to read. Julian watched his face the way he had watched Richard Voss's face, not with satisfaction, but with the focused attention of someone monitoring a process that needs to go a specific way. The warmth did not drain from Sterling's face immediately. It drained in stages, the way temperature leaves a space when the source of heat is removed. First the surface layer, then gradually the deeper warmth, until what remained was the baseline material that had always been underneath. Sterling was a man of considerable composure. He had achieved the kind of composure that comes from having faced serious situations over many years and having always come through them. He read 12 pages without speaking. Then he closed the folder. "This is a creative interpretation of a series of legitimate business decisions," he said. The warmth was entirely gone from his voice. What remained was professionalism. The flat, precise professionalism of a man who meets threats with the same register he meets everything else. "My attorneys will address it in the appropriate venues." "Your attorneys are welcome to," Julian said. "In the meantime, I'd like to draw your attention to the 2 vehicles at the far end of the block." He nodded toward the end of the street, where 2 cars sat. They've been there since 11 o'clock. One belongs to the investigative reporter at the city's largest newspaper. The other belongs to the correspondent who covers infrastructure development for a national publication. Both of them received the full 47-page file at 10 p.m. tonight. The story goes to press in approximately 5 hours unless something significant changes. The significant change that could alter that timeline would be if the district attorney's office, which received the file at 9 p.m., chooses to open a formal criminal investigation tonight rather than waiting for morning. In that case, the story becomes a different kind of story with different legal constraints, and your attorneys will have a considerably more complex situation on their hands than they will if they simply have to address a civil complaint. Sterling looked at the cars at the end of the block. A long look. Then he looked back at Julian. "You've been thorough," he said. "A woman is dead," Julian said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The level voice, the quiet voice, the voice that has decided what it is saying and does not need volume to mean it. She was 31 years old. She had a daughter who is 8 years old and who has now lost the only person in her life. This happened because you needed a building vacated and you chose methods that you knew, or should have known, created a serious risk to the life of a vulnerable person living in it. God may be patient, Mr. Sterling. I am not. The silence between them lasted for what felt like a long time. Then Sterling said very quietly, "What do you want? Tonight, your crew goes home. Tomorrow morning, your attorneys call mine and begin a conversation about restitution, remediation, and your cooperation. Genuine cooperation, not performative cooperation, with the criminal investigation I expect will be open before the end of the week. This week, the Transit Authority receives formal notification that this site has unresolved legal complications requiring full resolution before any construction activity can proceed. And going forward, you understand clearly, permanently, with no ambiguity, that what was done to Clara Beaumont is documented, witnessed, and in the possession of people whose professional obligation is to do something about it. That is what I want." Sterling looked at the folder in his hands, at the cars at the end of the block, at Julian. He turned to his crew. "Pack it up," he said. "We're done here tonight." The workers went back to the vans. The SUV started. Sterling got in. As the door closed, he looked at Julian through the window, a look that held many things and that Julian held steadily without looking away, because looking away would have been a kind of concession, and there was nothing left in this situation that Julian was prepared to concede. Then the vehicles drove away and Julian was alone on the sidewalk in front of Clara Beaumont's building in the cold December night. He looked up at the dark windows of the third floor. The plastic sheeting was still visible on the inside of the glass, Clara's improvised insulation, bought with part of the $2,500 check, placed there with the care of a woman trying to hold her life together with the materials available to her. He stood there for a while in the cold she had lived in for months, and he thought about the things he had done and the things he had not done, and the one that mattered most. He had not been paying attention. He had been sitting in a restaurant 40 minutes away, in a room with no prices on the menu, and a world had existed on the other side of the staff door that he had passed through hundreds of times without once wondering about the people who were on the other side of it. He would not make that mistake again. The district attorney announced the opening of a criminal investigation into Victor Sterling on Friday. Sterling's attorneys began restitution discussions the following Monday. The Transit Authority issued a formal halt order on all site preparation activity 3 weeks later. The $4.2 billion project that had required Clara Beaumont's death, that had calculated it, weighed it, and decided it was acceptable, was placed on indefinite hold. God had seen everything. Every hour, every cracked hand, every cold night, Every deliberate decision made in an office by a man who never once had to feel the cold himself. God had seen. And the reckoning had come. God may be patient, Mr. Sterling. I am not. Comment those words if they hit you somewhere that needed to be hit. Because there are Victor Sterlings in every city, in every industry, who believe that the darkness belongs to them. Who believe that the people they harm have no voice and no recourse and no one who will stand still in the cold at midnight and say, "Not this time." Be the person who stands still. Share this right now. Because the last part, the part that belongs entirely to Maya, is the reason this story was worth telling. The funeral for Clara Beaumont was held on a Saturday in January, in a small church on Drummond Street, 2 blocks from the apartment where she had lived. The church had room for perhaps 120 people. Every seat was taken. Some of them had known Clara. The woman from the second floor of the building who had slipped notes under the apartment door when things got bad. "I have extra soup, take it, no need to return the pot." The older man from the transit bus she took every day who had always saved her the seat behind the driver without being asked. The woman at the clinic who had treated her lungs 2 years ago, and who had given her a number to call if things got worse and had cried when the call came, and it was Julian's assistant rather than Clara. Some of them had not known her but had come anyway, because the story had been told by then in the newspaper and then beyond it, and there are people in every city who understand without needing it explained, that the funeral of a woman like Clara is a place where you should be present if you can be, because presence is a form of testimony and some things need to be witnessed. Julian sat in the back row. He had not expected to be emotional. He had been in many serious situations over the course of his life, and had learned to process them with a degree of equanimity that he generally considered a professional asset. But the sight of Maya in the front pew, wearing a black dress that someone had found for her, holding a photograph of her mother in her lap, her back straight and her face composed with the same dignity that Clara had brought into every room she had ever cleaned, did something to him that he had not predicted and did not try to stop. Maya spoke at the service. She stood at the front of the church, barely tall enough to see over the lectern, and she spoke for 4 minutes in a voice that was entirely steady. Julian would think about that steadiness for a long time afterward. The effort it must have required from an 8-year-old girl standing in front of the people who had come to say goodbye to her mother, and the source of the steadiness, which was not the absence of grief but something that had been built inside her by a woman who had taught her, through example and repetition and the patient, daily instruction of a mother who understood that her daughter might one day need to stand exactly here in exactly this situation. "My mama worked 14 hours every day," Maya said. "Her hands hurt all the time. She never once complained about it. She said work was a form of prayer, that when you do your work with honesty and care in your whole self, God sees it, even when no one else does, even when no one else is looking. She said that the most important thing a person can do is be worthy of the life they've been given. I want to be worthy of mine. I want to be worthy of hers." She paused. The church was very still. "My mama should not have died. She was 31 years old. She had so much left to give. The people who took her from me, they thought they could do it without consequences because people like my mama are not supposed to have consequences to offer. They were wrong. And I want everyone in this room to hear me say it clearly. They were wrong. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure that people like them stay wrong. That is my promise to my mama. That is what I am going to do with the life she gave me." She returned to her seat. The church stayed still for another moment. Then someone began to clap, not the reflexive applause of an audience at a performance but the slow, deliberate applause of people who are honoring something, and others joined, and the sound rose in the small church on Drummond Street while Maya sat in the front pew with her mother's photograph in her lap and her back straight and her face composed and her eyes finally very bright. In the parking lot afterward, she found Julian beside his car. "Can we talk?" she asked. They sat in the car with the heater running. Julian told her everything: Victor Sterling, the transit project, the file, the criminal investigation, the halt order, the restitution discussions. He told her because she had earned the right to know all of it. Because she was 8 years old and she had walked 40 minutes in the cold, and she was the reason any of it had happened, and the people whose reason you are owe you the truth about what you set in motion. Maya listened to every word without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the photograph. "Is he going to prison?" she asked. "I believe there is a serious possibility. The investigation is active. The evidence is strong. I can't promise you a specific outcome because the legal process has its own timeline and its own variables. But I can tell you that what was done to your mother has been documented, is being taken seriously, and is in the hands of people whose job is to do something about it. But people know what he did." "Yes, people know." She nodded slowly. "Mama always said that truth has a way of coming out. That you can hide things in the dark, but God's light always finds the cracks. That you can build walls around the truth, but eventually the truth gets through. And when it does, the walls you built to contain it become the evidence against you." She paused. She was right about that. She was, Julian said. Then he told her about the trust fund, the account he had established, funded at a level that would carry her through her entire education and into adulthood, that would ensure that the material circumstances of her life from this point forward would not be determined by the circumstances of her mother's death. He told her about Clara's cousins, who had come forward and were good people who wanted to give her a home. He told her he would be present in whatever way was useful and wanted, and absent in whatever way was intrusive and not. He told her, explicitly and without qualification, that the choice was hers. Maya listened to all of it with the same full, careful attention she brought to everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I don't want the trust fund," she said. "Can you tell me why?" "Because Mama taught me that what you earn is yours in a way that what you're given can never be. It doesn't matter how much someone gives you, if you didn't earn it, there's a part of you that will always know the difference, and that part of you will always be a little less certain about who you are. I want to know who I am. I want to know it because I work to know it. I want to put the money in the account myself, $1 at a time, the way Mama did." She looked at the photograph. "I think she would want that for me too." "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Not right now. When you're grown. When you've done the work." She looked at the photograph for a moment longer. Then at Julian. "I want to be a lawyer," she said. "A housing lawyer. I want to know every law that exists to protect people like my mama. And I want to know every law that people like Victor Sterling use against people like my mama. And I want to be in the room, the actual room, the courtroom, the negotiating room, the room where the decisions get made, arguing for the people who can't get into the room themselves. I want to make sure that no one else's mama dies in a cold apartment because a powerful man needed the land under her feet. I want that to be my life's work. I want to do it for as long as I can do it." Julian was quiet for a moment. "There are 2 things I want from you," Maya said. "Not the trust fund. 2 specific things. Tell me." "I want a headstone for Mama. A good one, a proper one with her full name and her dates. And I want 1 line on it. 1 line that says exactly what she was. She did honest work. She did it with dignity. She was worthy of the life she was given." Her voice, for the first time in the conversation, was not entirely steady. She took a breath and made it steady again. She would have wanted people to know that she worked honestly, that she never cheated anyone, that she had dignity even when the world was doing everything it could to take it from her. I want that on the stone so that anyone who ever stands at her grave knows who she was. It will be there, Julian said. Every word. And I want a scholarship. Not a gift, a scholarship. With an application process and an evaluation committee and criteria that are about academic performance and commitment to the work. Something I have to earn. Something where when I receive it, if I receive it, it's because I was the best candidate, not because someone felt sorry for me. Named after my mama. So her name is attached to something that lifts people up, for as long as the scholarship exists. That's what I want. I'll establish it, Julian said. Named after Clara Beaumont. Awarded annually. The application process will be open, competitive, and evaluated by a committee I have no influence over. Your application will go through the same process as everyone else's. Maya looked at him for a long moment. That look, the same evaluating look she had given him in the restaurant on the first night, the look that asked, "Are you the kind of person who means the things you say, or are you the kind who says them and means something adjacent?" "You're a good man, Mr. Hayes," she said. "I think God put you in that restaurant on purpose. I think you were the right person for the 5th try. I think if it had been someone else, something else might have happened, or nothing might have happened. But it was you. And I think that was on purpose." "I've been thinking something similar," he said. "Mama always said that God doesn't make mistakes about where He puts people. That we're placed where we're placed for a reason, and the reason reveals itself when we're brave enough to do the thing the moment is asking of us." She held the photograph in both hands, her mother's face and her own younger face laughing on a beach in the sun. "I was scared that night. When I walked to the restaurant. When I waited outside in the cold. When I tried the first 4 people and they all said no. I was very, very scared. But Mama had taught me that the bravery is the walking. Not the not being scared. Just putting one foot in front of the other even when every part of you wants to stop. That's all bravery ever is." Julian thought about a small girl in a faded red coat with a safety pin holding the collar closed, trembling in a restaurant that cost more per plate than her mother earned in a shift, asking a stranger for help because she had been taught that asking was courage and not weakness, and having already been told no 4 times and being willing to ask a 5th. "She taught you everything," he said. "She taught me everything," Maya said. "Now I just have to make it count." On the headstone of Clara Beaumont, in a small cemetery on the south side of the city. Clara Beaumont. She did honest work. She did it with dignity. She was worthy of the life she was given. And she raised a daughter who will make sure the world knows it. The bravery isn't the not being scared. The bravery is the walking. Clara taught her that. With bleeding hands. In a frozen apartment. With 6 weeks of stolen wages and lungs that were already failing. She still taught her daughter to walk toward the way through. Even when she was scared. Even when she was very, very scared. "We need 3 things from you right now, and we mean all 3. Keycap 1 leave a like in the comments for Clara Beaumont. Say her name. She deserves to be remembered by every single person who heard this story. Keycap 2 tell us in the comments, which moment stayed with you the longest? Was it Maya walking 40 minutes alone? Clara pressing the check to her chest with her bleeding hands? The apartment at 41 degrees? Maya at the lectern 8 years old back straight saying they were wrong, and I will spend my life making sure they stay wrong? Or the last thing Maya said in the car? Tell us. One moment. We will read every single comment. Keycap 3 share this story right now with someone who needs to hear it. Not tomorrow. Right now. Because there are Claras in every city, in every building, doing work that sustains the world and being paid nothing and being seen by no one. And there are Mayas in every city who have been taught to be brave and just need someone to be the 5th person. God puts people in our path for a reason. Be the 5th person. Be the reason.